We made this.
Hello and welcome to Pick a Disc, the podcast where someone picks a disc to talk about for whatever reason they want to. My name's Latham, and today Pragya from the Real Asian Podcast is the guest talking about a video game soundtrack. Now, we've talked about soundtracks in the past, but those are more jukebox ones with like songs songs and stuff. But this is a score. This is like pieces of music, and there's about 4 hours worth of it, and we have a good in-depth chat about the game that the songs are about. And the game in question is Final Fantasy X or Final Fantasy X, depending on which side of the ocean that you live on. And we talk about the game a lot. We talk about how the themes of the game get applied to the music and just exactly the context around the music and the score and stuff. And it's just a really interesting chat. I'm a massive Final Fantasy nerd, so to talk about the game and to talk about how the music goes with the game as well, it was just a great excuse for me to chat with that. So before I hit play on the interview with Pragya, just a reminder, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter under Pick a Disc. There is a Discord server, the Pick a Discord, that you can join to go and just tell us what music you're listening to or to moan about the podcast. And if there's any podcast app that allows you to review, remember that golden age. I want you the golden rule about the podcast is that I want you to commit opinion fraud and tell people that we are 5 stars when in fact we are only about 3-star worthy, and that will get more people in to discover that we're 3-star worthy, and then you can tell people, and then I can tell people that I'm 5-star worthy, and then get more people to discover that people lie about things on the internet. Who'd have thought? Anyway, I'm rambling on again, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit back and then press play on the interview and talk to Pragya. Okay, just saying before we started recording that I was really looking forward to talking about this, the disc that you've picked, which I'll reveal in a second. But with me is Pragya from the Real Asian Podcast.
Yes.
Yes, and for those with long-term memories, remember that I spoke to Ray almost a year ago about Usher's Confessions, which was a great episode. But so how you doing, Pragya? You okay?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be on here. Ray had sent us a Slack message that had like 2 or 3 podcasts, and I was like, I immediately wanted to do this one, and I was joking about how I was going to go on here and do the Digimon soundtrack, and we did end up doing something similar, but I'll let you get into that.
Yeah. I mean, I did talking about Digimon. I kind of missed the Digimon for craze, just by a couple of years. I was firmly into the camp Pokemon at the time. I think I was about 15. I think when Pokemon kicked off here. So I was like, by the time Digimon kicked off, I think I was about 18. So I was yeah. So it was still cool. It was still cool to like Digimon, Pokemon, but no, yeah. So yeah, the one that you picked, because you gave me a list, and I'm like, and to be fair, I would listen to any of them, but there's one that stood out. I was like, we can talk for far too long about that one. Yeah, and that's the one you ended up picking. So without beating around the bush, and so that we can actually finally start talking about it, Pragya, why don't you tell the lovely listeners the disc that you've picked for today?
Okay, so without further ado, I have chosen the music of Final Fantasy X. So that is the original soundtrack by the series composer is Nobuo Uematsu, and this time he had some help, which is not usual. So it's Nobuo Uematsu along with Masashi Hamauzu and Junya Nakano.
Yeah, from the video game Final Fantasy X, surprisingly. Yeah, so when you announced this, I was like, yes. Immediately, I was like, there is not many. I'm not someone who listens to kind of scores or soundtracks at all. I think I said I'm not much for instrumentals, but there are a few exceptions to the rule. I've got a list of episodes I want to do as a map pick for one day, where someone comes on, is the host, and they interview me like I'm interviewing you, and not this game, but there's a Final Fantasy game soundtrack on that list, which is a different game to the series of this one. But yeah, and as soon as you said 10, I was like, yes, 10's one of my favourites in the series. So from my hands glee to talk about this. So and Final Fantasy X is also one of the few video game soundtracks that I've actually sat down and listened to in the past before. So yeah, as soon as you said that, I was like, yep. We can talk. I can talk about that.
Really excited. I was like, oh well, I wasn't expecting to like hit a nerve there, but I clearly did.
Yeah,
he was like, yes.
So in the initial, the list that you gave me, this is one of the like short list. Why did you want to talk about this soundtrack?
This soundtrack, particularly for me, I would say Final Fantasy X or X is what I call it, because FFX, I guess, is probably my favorite Final Fantasy for sure. It came for me around, I think like a sort of like a pivotal time. I was like getting into, I think, like high school, and it was still on PS2. We picked it up completely randomly from Fry's Electronics, which Americans, or specifically people in the Bay Area, will know. It's like this really strange local electronics store that has like electronic gadgets and weird machines and stuff. So it also had video games at the time. And we just got it because it was like $9.99, and at the time, like video games would be like $50 or something. So, and then we started playing it, and I almost think that I started playing this video game after Kingdom Hearts. So Kingdom Hearts, no, for sure, no. I definitely played this one first. So yeah, so I started playing this video game around the same time that Kingdom Hearts came out, because I remember that in Kingdom Hearts, you can run around playing Titus and like, you know, like, or Titus, I think is how it's pronounced, and like play with Waka and stuff. So I love that. But the point being, I've gotten a little long-winded. I chose it because like, I think this was like the first Final Fantasy, which like, I just was like completely into. I spent like, you spent like 100 hours in the game. I probably spent that much time as well. And so like, just literally listening to the soundtrack all the time. And now, like if I'm going on long drives, or if I have just like a, you know, like a little lull, sometimes I'll listen to the soundtrack just to get back into those feelings and that nostalgia. And it's just such a good soundtrack overall. Like it just takes you to a different place. So that's why I wanted to choose it.
Yeah. So it was the first Final Fantasy game you ever played then. So you hadn't played 7 or 8 or 9 beforehand?
So 7 and the ones before, I have a funny little story. So I actually immigrated from India to America. So when those games were getting real big, we didn't actually have access to the PlayStation 1. We didn't know what a lot of that stuff was. Okay. So it was like a little bit later that like we were all able to figure out like, oh, there's this thing called video games and we can get a PS2 and like play them. So I came in right at Final Fantasy X.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that was like, so it was the first game he discovered, and he did. So it was just like randomly, you just saw it for $10 and you thought, oh yeah, we'll just get it because it's $10. Or so you didn't. So did you know what you was buying, or
no?
Was it just?
I mean, so funny though. I had seen Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, the movie, because at the time,
and you still decided to go and play it.
I know. Well, because, you know, the movie, for someone who doesn't, like, is a kid at the time and doesn't think too hard, was still visually, like, striking and pretty cool. So I was like, oh, this must be kind of similar. We'll do it.
I think I was, when did it come out? Was it 2000? 2001 it came out?
Maybe something like that, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, I think so, 2001, 2002, yes.
Right, okay. So I probably would have seen it on DVD when I was about 18 or 19. So I was in prime dickhead mode. So, so yeah,
right. You would have judged that one very hard. I remember the storyline. I don't remember it being very impressive, but visually there was, Yeah,
I can remember me being kind of like, particularly 18, 19, so your typical kind of arrogant, arrogant.
It's
like,
that age.
Yeah, that kind of like an, oh yeah, well you think you know more than you actually do. And I was like, oh no, this is awful. And then we watched it a couple of years ago, and I like to say that, yeah, actually, young me was still right about it. I'm not much of a fan of it, but I was, but then I'd played 7, 8, and 9 at that point. My my kind of origin story with Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy VII was the first one that I played, and the first time I picked up Final Fantasy VII was, I think my sister was in hospital or something. We went to go and see and visit her in like the kind of children's ward area. And they had a bit where there was rolling out TVs, and they had like a PlayStation on the TV that they rolled around, different people could play on. And when she had the PlayStation and stuff, and she wasn't much, so I ended up playing it while I was visiting my sister. And the game, I can't. No, it's either I think it was Parappa the Rapper and Final Fantasy VII were the two games that they had playing it. And I was just, and I think there's like, it was just like the introduction bit of Final Fantasy VII, so I ended up playing some of that. And then I think then I asked for it for that Christmas, and then my love affair with the Final Fantasy series had grown from that.
It began.
Yeah. Right. In terms of Final Fantasy X, I think as I've gotten older, I've appreciated Final Fantasy X a lot more. Final Fantasy X's always been my second favourite, and I think it still is. But the only reason it's not my favourite, because I think it's got it's my favourite battle system out of the series. It's probably got my favourite plot of the series. It's got and there's a lot of it that's probably my favourite out of the series. But the only reason that is that I've got a strong emotional attachment to Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII, as you grow older, you realise just how crazy and how illogical the story is, and like how much it was rushed, and how it doesn't hold together. But there's just some charm about it.
Right.
But then Final Fantasy X, I think that's probably the game in the series I've played the most. I said that there's at least 2 or 3 occasions where I've clocked up at least 120 hours on each playthrough at least, and the combination of that nearly being 400 hours worth of my life that I've given to that game.
Right. And funny you mentioned Final Fantasy VIII, because I do love on that soundtrack, like Eyes on Me, the Fei Wong, right? That one is just, I mean, similarly, I think carries sort of that nostalgia and everything. Even though I didn't play that one, I was just exposed to it peripherally.
Yeah.
But I think it bears mentioning that the Final Fantasies of that era, like starting at 7, and I think going up to 10, had like a completely sort of different impact as far as like the emotional attachment, and I think like the place that they held in their fans' sort of lives than I think the ones that came after. I mean, the ones that came after were great, but I just don't feel that same sense of like evocative, like, this was like something big in my life,
Yeah, I think my third favourite in the series is 12. Because I think
12 is a fun one.
I think 12 gets overlooked, I think, a few times, but I think 12 is I still think 12 is the last kind of traditional Final Fantasy
one.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's different to like the old school ones, but I think from 12 onwards they kind of adapted the games and stuff. 13's the only one I've actively disliked, and I quite like 15, but I've not
I like 15 as well.
Yeah, I liked 15, but I've not actually played it since they've done all the kind of patches to it.
I only played like the really bare bones version where you were literally running around in like the open world and like just taking in the scenery. And I think for that one, the visuals were far more striking than the music. And I think like their opening song was like Lean on Me, which as an American has like completely different connotations. So I definitely wasn't able to get into it the same way that I did the other ones.
But I think one of the highlights, and it does get overlooked by 7, and as much as I do love Final Fantasy 7, it's in the Final Fantasies that I like, it's kind of in the middle of the table. And I do think that Final Fantasy 7 kind of overshadows quite a bit of stuff, even though technically Final Fantasy X is the first Final Fantasy to actually get a direct sequel, saying that, but I think Final Fantasy X has like a kind of special place where it feels like the series is evolving. It's evolved. It's got a lot of firsts for the series. It's the first with voice acting. It's the first with polygons rather than pixels and sprites, and the camera can move, and the camera's fixed. Sorry, the camera's fixed, but the polygon count's quite high because I think they reduced the polygon count for 12, which meant you can move the cameras. But
the camera is fixed. You can move it a little bit to get like a different view of your battle thing, but nobody really cares for that.
I think it's the world map, but like. There's like the sense that, I mean, there isn't a world map, but you've got the sense that you're actually traversing through this world, and that's an idea I want to get back to and talk to a couple of the tracks
Yes.
later on.
Can't
but
wait.
but yeah, the game kind of just blew my mind, and I love the CTB system, which is the conditional time battle system. For basically anyone who's listening to this, and has no idea what we're talking about in terms of Final Fantasy series, the Final Fantasy series are a series of role-playing games that have been around since 1987, I think. 87 or 88, I think. Originally on the Nintendo, then the Super Nintendo, then eventually went to the PlayStation. Anyone, I don't need to explain to you about Final Fantasy VII. You wouldn't. Anyone who knows anything about computer games will have heard the term Final Fantasy VII. Turned a kind of national, a national phenomenon into a global phenomenon, and changed. This is the same era that we had Metal Gear Solid that come out as well. There were kind of a series of games that changed how storytelling was able to be done in video games. And then in the lead up and the hype to get to when the PS2 came out, people were like, "Oh, what's the Final Fantasy game's going to come out?" And they came out with Final Fantasy X, and I'm not going to get too much more into details. We're not technically a video game podcast, but yeah. So, okay. So, briefly, we're gonna.
Wait! You didn't tell them what the conditional based system was.
You know,
you forgot. You went on the tangent, but you didn't tell them.
Yeah. And yes, the CTB system is. When I talk about the CTB system, the Final Fantasy games, the original series had this thing called the ATB system, which was called the Active Time Battle system, which was kind of revolutionary at the time, where there's basically original old school role playing games, or some called turn based, where you take a turn, you hit your enemy, the enemy takes a turn, and it's like chess more or less, where everyone has a go in, everyone has one go sequentially. The active time battle system is kind of like that, but what happens is there is each character in a battle has what's called a speed stat, and there's a time it takes for you to choose. So a character that's very, very quick could theoretically have 2 attacks before an enemy has 1 attack, and that's the active time battle. The CTB, the conditional time battle for Final Fantasy X, was where was basically you had the speed stat, but there's no time gauge. But basically, you had a list of who could go first, and depending on how, I don't know how the maths worked, but theoretically, depending on your stats, it'd work out when a player would be able to have an attack or be able to do a move. And sometimes, depending if your character had a faster speed stat, you could have 2 in. But it wasn't. But it didn't mean there wasn't a timing bit, which meant you could spend there for ages trying to figure out
decide what you're gonna do.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that. I love that. I love that thing. And to this day, I think it's my favourite evolution of the battle system for Final Fantasy and stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, and again, yeah. So before we talk about the album, we'll talk about perhaps a bit more of the game setting and the bit before game setting, because I think that's a bit fundamental in how to get an understanding of the music. I want to briefly talk about Uematsu himself. Nobuo Uematsu was born March 21st, 1959. He's a Japanese musician and composer, best known for his contributions to the Final Fantasy video game series by Square Enix. He was self-taught and began playing piano at the age of 12, with English singer-songwriter Elton John as one of his biggest influences. Uematsu joined Square in 1986, where he first met Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi. Was that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, that was very good.
I'm going to apologise in advance if I kind of mispronounce the some of the Japanese names. The only thing that I was ever told was that the Japanese is monosyllabic, so if you know that, it's easy to pronounce. So I'm going to try my best, but feel free to correct me if I get it wrong. So the two later worked together on many titles of the company, most notably in the Final Fantasy series. After 2 decades with Square, Uematsu left in 2004 to start his own production company, which included the Dog Ear Records music label. He has since composed music as a freelancer for other games, including ones developed by Square Enix and Sakaguchi's development studio, Miss Walker. And he's done he's done loads of stuff. His video games works have been performed in various concerts, where he's worked with Grammy Award-winning conductor Arnie Roth on several of these performances. In the 2000s, he was in the keyboardist of the hard rock band The Black... I didn't realise he was in the Black Mages. I just learned something. I didn't realise... I thought that was a fan-based thing. I didn't realise he was in that. So, the Black Mages, alongside Square Enix colleagues Kenichiro Fukue and Tsuyoshi Sekito. The band played various rock-arranged versions of Uematsu's Final Fantasy compositions. He has since performed with the Earthbound Pappers, and he has formed the successors to the Black Mages in 2001. He is sometimes referred to as the Beethoven of video game music, and has made several appearances in the annual Classic FM Hall of Fame. So, yeah, pretty much the majority.
He's a legend.
He's a legend. Pretty much at some point, if you play any game from Japan, you might have heard Uematsu's music. So, I mean, do you actively listen to the soundtracks separately from? Do you actually listen to video game soundtracks separately in your own time, or is?
I absolutely do. So you said that you're not someone who listens to soundtrack music, like instrumentals and whatnot. I, on the other hand, will sometimes get a random craving for like just specific like soundtrack music, and on my daily, like I will listen to anime openings or whatnot, but then there are like very specific days where I'll just be like, today I want to listen to Dearly Beloved for an hour straight, and that's what I'll do. So I am a person who will listen to video game soundtracks, as well as spend quite a bit of time on the internet or like on Instagram posting like stories of like nature pictures and whatnot. So usually I will think about like, you know, the feeling of the photo and then attach a soundtrack from it, usually in lo-fi because Instagram doesn't have the originals, but I interact with the content quite frequently myself.
Oh, okay. So in terms of nature, so you're quite, so when you say you go looking at nature stuff, so you say like nature photography as well, is that something you're into, or?
Yes, I do. But you know, so I have my DSLR, and I used to do it far more seriously in the past. And now it's more just I try to go into nature and be more present, and you know, it's sort of I go for a walk to calm down or whatnot. And in that sense, there's not always a need for me to even listen to music when I'm doing it. But if I do, I will listen to soundtrack music. And usually if I end up taking a picture that I like, I'll attach soundtrack music to it. I am not a person who can take walks or do work or do anything and listen to music in the background. If I'm listening, well, except for driving, but if I'm listening to music, then I have to be paying attention to the music, or I get not overwhelmed, but I get uncomfortable. Like I just feel like I'm not doing either thing and I don't like it.
Oh, okay. Well,
yes.
That's interesting. Because I know some people in the past that like usually have the music playing while they'll. I've had a couple of guests in the past that will walk, like they'll go on like long walks through the countryside or anything, and will often have kind of stuff soundtracking their what they're watching. But yeah, it's kind of it's refreshing to hear that someone doesn't actively do that. But then, do you often think about music while you're walking? While you're walking, like you're not like thinking, oh, that's a nice photo, I'll take a picture, and then thinking what song would go that.
Right. So it's not like, you know, a logical process necessarily, but I'll end up like taking a picture of something I see because it evokes a certain feeling, and I'll be like, this is for sure, like, you know, for instance, Besaid Island, like it just like gives me that feeling. So I'll attach it for anybody who sees that photo so they can get like that full sort of experience from it.
Okay. Well, that's a nice way of associating those images then. But yeah.
I mean, It's just a personal hobby, but I think it's still fun.
No, it's really nice. I mean, like occasionally, like, I mean, but then again, I'm kind of weird in that some people, because often go out running, and sometimes I'm running in the countryside and stuff, but I can't run to music. I have to listen to podcasts. That's mainly to keep my attention. So if I end up going for too long, then I've just got something in my ears to give me attention and stuff. But
right.
yeah.
I can't run to music either, but it's because I'll start like reacting emotionally to the music while I'm running and I'm out of breath. So it's very like uncomfortable.
No, actually, no, I fully understand that bit. So the Final Fantasy X soundtrack. So, okay, so the game is going to be 22 years old this year, and I can feel my hair going grey as I say that. I'm going to caveat there that I'm going to say there potentially will be spoilers, but I think they're going to be spoilers for the game plot because there are aspects of the story that you find out later on, but there's no way of really talking about the themes of the story without spoiling some of it. So if any of you have got any inkling whatsoever to either to play Final Fantasy X, or if you're currently playing Final Fantasy X, then I recommend you perhaps press stop and then come back to this episode a bit later on, because because there are story developments and themes that are more apparent in the second half of the game, which get reflected to the music, and I can't really know how to talk about it without spoiling it. So
right, it's one of those games that starts in a weird point. I think it's called in medias res, where it starts literally in the middle somewhere, and then it takes you back, and so if we start talking about it, you've got spoilers.
Yeah. So because Final Fantasy X, for those of you who haven't played it and probably won't have any attention to, I'm going to I'm not going to try and explain a lot of it because it will be here for a long time. I'm going to try and summarize it as very quickly as I can. So Final Fantasy X is the very gist of the game is that there is this world called Spira, and every 10 years it gets attacked by this entity called Sin. And every 10 years when this entity of Sin comes back, there are citizens of this fictional world who choose to go on what's called a pilgrimage, where they will travel to different temples across the planet to gain support of these mythical creatures called Aeons, and then with the aid of friends with them called Guardians, they go to this final place to battle Sin, and then to bring forth what's called the Calm, which is another period of time before Sin comes back. And that's the very gist of it. The story comes in when we get entered in the story where the main character, who's a guy called I've always referred to him as Titus, and then when James Arnold Taylor, who does the US voice, was being interviewed on the DVD that came with the game, referred to him as Tidus, I was like, wait, what?
This is one of those Japanese things, because Titus would be spelled very differently from Tidus, and they just went with it's not Ta-E, it's T, so it's Tidus.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's just one of those weird things where, like, when people start, like, for years, in Final Fantasy VIII, I kept referring to him as Seifer, and then but then the character's actually supposed to be called Cypher, and I was like,
that's so annoying.
15 years
of
calling him Seifer.
Yeah, it's like shock. You're like, no, I'm just going to call him what I've been calling him. You can't change my mind.
Yeah. So but then Final Fantasy X kind of follows this young man who's like a major sports star from this place called Zanarkand. And when we start the game, he's the Lionel Messi of this sport called Blitzball. He's famously the son of the world's best blitzball player ever, who went missing 10 years ago. Then what happens when he's playing a game? Sin attacks his town, this city that he's in. One of his father's companions finds him and basically grabs him, and then next thing you know, Tidus finds himself 1,000 years in the future, and then joins one of these citizens who's going on this pilgrimage called Yuna, and she's known as a summoner, and then he becomes one of her guardians, and the game pretty much follows the pilgrimage that she makes up to try and battle Sin. And it's a lot more complex than that. There's a lot more complex. There's a lot more context. There's a lot more subtlety in it, which we'll probably reveal a bit more as we go on. But that's generally the gist of the game. The themes of the game is actually quite somber. It's quite in my research. There's a lot of Nietzsche.
There
Referenced.
is.
There's one of existentialism is a key theme. The nature of life and death is a theme, and perhaps the biggest theme, and I never got this until about like at least a decade and a half after, is that the game is both in praise of and critical of religion. It's amazing. It's amazingly critical about religion and organised religion, but also celebrates the positive sides of religion as well. And it's probably its main key theme, which as a 16, 17-year-old completely threw over my head. But
I definitely picked it up, partially because one of the Aeons is called Shiva, and as a Indian person coming out of India, that would be a very strong reference that I should look around and figure out what this thing feels like about religion. I'm not particularly organized religion or religious myself, but it's just like that knowledge that comes with the context. But I did want to say, while you were on the topic, really quickly about the themes of the game, that I want to add that there is sort of this idea of man versus nature versus technology also happening, which is key to the religious conversation that it has, or like anyway about the meaning of things. And this is very important for listeners to know, because the entire soundtrack is sort of subsumed in this. It's not existential in the sense that we think of it, where there's dread and doom, but it's just a melancholy, and there's a melancholic feel, even if it's like particularly upbeat, but the whole soundtrack has like this melancholy sort of like weave through it.
You're perfectly right. There's like a very dour downbeat feeling from the outset, which I think is like, in comparison to the previous game where Final Fantasy IX was created in response to the dour protagonists of 7 and 8. 9 is a lot more upbeat. It's got a lot more of a proactive. I say a lot more of a proactive protagonist. The protagonist of Final Fantasy X is quite upbeat. He's quite upbeat and kind of outgoing from the get-go, but he's in a world where there's like this whole inevitability that he's not aware of at first,
and he has that sort of like very, I mean now I guess it's considered millennial, but he's like doing this thing, and he's got like a upbeat go-getter attitude. He's obviously, like you said, like the sports star and athlete, and then almost just like right behind the veneer is this like child with a bunch of daddy issues clearly, and other things that he's holding on to that he needs to work through, which he ends up working through, I think, as he goes through the game.
And it's and you wouldn't have thought that like existential dread and fear of death, and fear of death and stuff would work really well with a story that. And again, I'm not going to get too much into detail, but the world of Spira is, if I'm not sure which religions it's referring to, I do think that it's more. I do think that perhaps its more critical aspects of it are aimed perhaps more towards Christianity than perhaps other ones. But if you imagine a world where what people believe in religion could actually be proven to be right, that's what Spira is. There's a religion there's like a major kind of religion that's formed, but the religion's there because they've seen evidence of the supernatural or the fantastical, and it's actually there. But then there's still there's a kind of belief system that's been created, and that belief system throughout the game is actually turned out to be false, and the people behind the belief system knowingly are aware of it being false, and as you carry on, it's like kind of depressing and at the time, but there's still a kind of a layer of hope and a layer of optimism that is underneath. And in the soundtrack as well, you've got this kind of, as you said, this kind of melancholy throughout, but there is always things of that last speck of hope. It's the last little white light of hope that comes out of Pandora's box that kind of nestles underneath a lot of the music in here. So, and the story in the game kind of clings onto that last bit of hope.
And I think it's important to know that, you know, as a reference to Christianity specifically, in the story we have these ideas of like a sacrificial lamb, or like not just that, but also like a Jesus type character where like the summoner comes in and saves everybody for 10 years, right? And so it is that idea of the sin. So it is like mirroring sort of real world analogies with its disillusionment with organized religion. And then there is, I think the final thing I wanted to say was the concept of death within the game itself. There is like a far plane, so it's sort of like you go on to a place, but there's for something Asian a very clear lack of like the concept of reincarnation as such, so that also informs its sensibilities.
Okay, because I know that in the game as well, the kind of nature of life and death is that, like, it's known and proven that the afterlife exists.
Right, they go on to the far plane, but they don't come back.
Yeah, so, and the far plane is something that actually there, and sometimes the far plane kind of can leak out to the the living, more or less, and I think as well there's a kind of like there's all like. These summoners, or the citizens, as I said, that go on these pilgrimages, they get these abilities to summon them, but they have also the ability to do what's called to send people.
Ascending, yes.
Yeah. So the idea being in the world of spirit that anyone who passes away needs to have a sending, or needs to be sent to the far plane.
Right.
For a real world context. Imagine that someone has to have a funeral, and whichever religious or practitioner is conducting the ceremony for the funeral starts dancing to make sure that the soul of the deceased goes on to the next life. Else what will happen is that the person in the coffin will turn into a massive monster, and and that's how the monsters are formed.
Right.
Yeah, and it sounds complex, and it is, but and
the reason that I mention, I think, about the reincarnation really fast is that within Asian cultures, reincarnation is associated with this idea of karma, right? So you come back again to continue this cycle of karma where you're doing actions and, you know, like it's having some sort of impact to a point, and then eventually you reach some sort of enlightenment stage where you can move on to the next world. In this game, it's sort of divorced from that. There's this idea of sin. There's this idea of Xanarkand, spoiler alert, being destroyed because it became too dependent on this thing called like machina and became too unspiritual, so to speak, which is why this other land is called Spira, right? And so then the game spends most of its time in Spira grappling with the spirituality in Spira. And I think that as we were talking about with the melancholy, it feels wrong to everybody. Like we're on this death mission to save everyone. People are dying, and this thing called sin keeps coming back over and over and over again. And that just like is, I think, the major sort of discomfort within both the game as well as like the music that comes with it.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things as well with that, particularly when you talk about some of the Asian influences or on the kind of nature of life and death in the game, Final Fantasy X was, I think, one of the first games in the series where the production team decided to take their influences on Asian culture and Asian kind of like the design of like kind of Asian cultures and Asian countries. So a lot of pretty much most of the previous games in the past have been more about being influenced by the Western world or mainly quite a lot of medieval Europe, and or the industrial centres,
right?
Central
Industrial,
Europe. Yeah, and particularly from Final Fantasy VI onwards, there's Final Fantasy 6 and 7 and 8 have a strong kind of European medieval kind of focus, but then also they also incorporate a lot more of a technological aspect of it, which comes into play a bit later on in Final Fantasy 10. But but there's in terms of the geographic design and the cultural design, there's a lot of the South Pacific. There's I think there's Thailand. I think there's
even Yuna's outfit is like a mix of different Asian sort of cultural dress. There's sort of a kimono aspect to it, but there's also something a little more Southeast Asian. So there's definitely a mix of influences there.
And that kind of influence also goes towards the music as well. So there is throughout the soundtrack and in the game, you have what are called these temples, and again, I'm going to throw in another component of this game's story and world building. Unfortunately, there's an element of the game called the Faith, which who are kind of the barrier between the living and the far plane, but are also kind of the physical manifestation of this religion that's there. And there's this thing called the hymn of the Faith.
I was just thinking about the hymn of the faith.
Yeah.
Right.
And there are variations of this throughout the game and in the soundtrack, but there is a very strong kind of almost Buddhist kind of chanting element to the music that has this kind of Eastern feel.
But they mixed
to the song.
it. I feel like there is some amount of Gregorian chanting sort of influence as well, especially with the Yu Yevon. It's very hard to reference without the sound actually playing, but they definitely did a mix. But yeah, go ahead.
Again, the term Yu Yevon is a term in the game which Yevon is the name of the religion that's in there in the game as well. And again, I apologise because it's kind of if you've not played Final Fantasy X, a lot of this might go over your head, unfortunately. But and I can only apologise enough if you just start throwing random terminology at you. But yeah, Yevon and Yu Yevon is the name of the religion based on the first ever summoner that was being created, and that kind of the Yevon name is what's linked to these kind of like religious songs that are played through and have that kind of like Eastern feel to them. Briefly touched upon the hymns of the faith that we just talked about, and those are kind of aspects throughout the song. So I think if we start moving towards because there's quite a lot of songs on this soundtrack. There's about 90 odd, and we're not going to have a chance to speak about all of them individually. So which pieces of music did you want to perhaps single out first?
Okay, so I think the very first one that bears talking about, actually no, I'm going to go with a different one. So it's the Prelude. The Prelude is kind of present across Final Fantasies, right? I think the Final Fantasy VII has the most sort of original or iconic prelude with the sort of harp or whatever kind of string music that is. In Final Fantasy X, they did something completely different with it, where it almost sounds a little bit 8-bit. It sounds video gamey, but it has at the very like core of it that same sort of like harmony to it. Have you listened to the prelude from Final Fantasy X?
Yeah, because that's the one that starts with that.
That one.
Yeah, and it's because it's the closest thing you got to a kind of common theme tune to Final Fantasy, which I think I've seen it referred to as the crystal theme in other games. Is that and it's kind of hard to actually try and do the thing because it feels like it's about a million different kind of triangles going on at once, doing that kind of twinkly noise. But you hear it, and it's as soon as you hear that, you know you're listening to a Final Fantasy game. But then it starts off with this, but it starts with a kind of weird original,
right? Kind
of no, like that kind of like, yeah, as you said, 8-bit Amiga music, so almost, yeah.
Right. And so I wonder why they chose to do that. for this game particularly, because obviously every piece of music kind of helps build the story, and it would have been very easy we were just talking about these melancholy themes, to choose a sort of like more overdone or like just like overly sad version of the prelude, but they really chose something that was like upbeat and running around. Like I had that image of me just running down the endless freaking grasslands or whatever.
Yeah. I think 'cause it's not the first piece of music that's in the game, is it?
Oh, it's not.
No.
Yes.
I think it might be just to kind of bring the excitement up for the players about to start, because that happened, cause that comes in
to balance.
That comes to balance for and I didn't want to speak about this song too early into it, but I think I'm going to have to.
Yes.
Because so I think pretty much one of the more famous pieces of music from this game comes at the very, very start.
Yep.
As we mentioned earlier, in Media Res, it's a song called it's a piece of music called To Zanarkand, and it's
it's iconic. That first like piano, like the first 4 bars, no, not 4 bars, I would say like it's 2 bars of piano. It's like the dun, I can't even sing, so I can't do it, but it's just like it as soon as you hear it, you're in a melancholy kind of sad mood. And the funny thing about To Zanarkand is also that Uematsu actually wrote it for his friend Seo for a flute performance, and then he decided it was too depressing and he closeted it, and then Final Fantasy X came around and he was like, perfect.
It's kind of sad, it's somber, it's if you want to put it to comparison, one of the first things you listen to in Final Fantasy X is a very militaristic marching drum beat, which emphasizes the military aspect of that game. So when you hear something like that, you're thinking, oh, okay, I know what to expect. And then when you first load up Final Fantasy X, you've got a group of people in a campfire. This kind of very kind of somber piano piece starts playing. Strings starts kicking. You've got this kind of weird blonde character wearing bright yellow in comparison, which makes him stand out. Like just looking over the ruins of this massive city, and it's quite, and you're like, oh, and you got this voiceover saying, "This is my story." In a very somber way.
He's like, we might not have a chance, but I want to tell it while I can.
Pretty much. Yeah, we're all probably going to die at this point, but. This is how we got here.
And that is where the game begins.
If you think about it, it's the 2000s version, very depressing version of the kind of record scratch meme that went around, where you got like record scratch. I bet you're wondering how I got in this situation.
Right.
It's the same thing, but it sets up the theme, the mood of the game, and at that point, if you're playing that game for the first time, you've got no idea what the characters are in that position. You get to the point in the game where that character's there, you've got full context of why that music's there, why everyone's being somber, because they're pretty much going to their deaths more or less. And when you load it up for the first time, well, for the second time, if you've played the game and you come back to it and you know the situation leading to that, when you hear that music and you see the campfire scene, which is the first thing, and you know the stuff on there, you're like, oh yeah. And it's kind of rewarding. It's a rewarding piece of music. So it's like, oh yeah, I know why I got depressed. I know why I have to be depressed at this moment, and I've not even pressed the gamepad button yet.
And it's also a piece of music that you can't just listen to in the background without like sort of, or at least this is for me, but it kind of brings the vibe around it. It's not down necessarily. It could be up, but like to that melancholy, somber feeling immediately, and then you have to pay attention to the piece because it just like goes on like that. But it's also got like an artistry to it. It's I would say almost like some kind of whimsical, and so the music of this game is so important to the feelings that it ends up evoking and like the things that we remember it for. And I think this piece is sort of, To Zanarkand is one of the main the central components for that effect.
So when you've got so when you got Susanna can come through, and you got the kind of somber being this is how we all going to die, or something, that kind of thing. So that's when the prelude kicks in for the title sequence, for the title sequence for the title page, and I think the prelude, if I remember rightly, kind of moves to the first time you meet Titus, where you meet the player character, and you're about to go, and he's like a celebrity and everything, and that music kind of carries on throughout that. So you've got so it kind of picks your mood back up, ready for that.
Right.
And I think the prelude and the kind of prelude kind of helps that that kind of transition from like, okay, there's an even foreboding to okay, yeah,
and then we're playing the blitzball game. So the music around Xanarkin is so funny because you obviously have two Xanarkin, which is just this somber piece, and then you have the other songs because Xanarkin's scenes are mostly about its like high frenetic energy and then its destruction. So the rest of the songs are like upbeat or like heavy metal or but that's really fun because that also like really carries you into that feeling.
Okay, so which song do you want to move on to next then?
So my next one that I wanted to talk about, because this is Final Fantasy, so I think it's quite common for each of the characters to have their themes, and so I wanted to talk about my favorite character theme, if this is the right moment to do it, and then maybe you could talk about yours as well. But for me, it's I don't know if this is basic or not basic, but it's Tidus's theme. I just really love that theme. It's introduced, he's standing on the ocean, like at the corner of the water, and like someone's talking about his father, like, oh, Jet was so cool, but then he just disappeared. And Tidus has a lot of angst about this because he saw what it did to his mother, I guess, and he feels like he'll never amount to what his father was. And then the song just starts playing, and it's like this like kind of guitar and strings piece that's like extremely melancholy, and that's my favorite character theme, and I think my favorite song on this soundtrack.
There's a lot of similarities, and I think a lot of references to previous games in that, because it sounds quite a lot similar to I can't remember which one it is, but there's a piece of music, I think it might be Balam Town from Final Fantasy VIII. There's a kind of like very guitar led kind of like acoustic guitar stuff that plays through, and interestingly as well is that when you see Tidus as a character, if you're seeing Tidus throughout in isolation, he comes across as being very hyperactive, very immature, very outgoing, and the music kind of is in contrast to him as a character, more or less.
Well, I would not say that it's like exact contrast, right? It's like overtly, it seems like there's a contrast, but the theme sort of references his more internal motivations and his more, I wouldn't even say hidden struggle, but it's the thing that's below the surface that sort of drives him. And so it's unexpected because it's definitely not like, oh, this is the main character and this is going to be their theme. It's not cool. It's not punchy. It's just very it's like calm and sad.
and that's kind of like the main character as a whole, because I think I think he's very kind of proactive as a character, but he's also very there's angst, but there's kind of justified angst when you start learning more about the character and his dad. His dad's actually quite a key character in the game, but if we get to him, we'll mention about him, because I don't want to start throwing more characters and names at people. But yeah, so it's kind of so it kind of is like a very nice. Without you knowing it, it's probably setting you up to understand the character.
It's definitely doing that.
Yeah. So you briefly mentioned about you want to know which one's my favourite of the character themes. My favourite character, and I think he might be my favourite character in a Final Fantasy game of all time, which is Auron.
I knew it. I was as soon as you said that, I was like, it's gonna be Auron.
So, yeah, I'm a big fan of. Again, I don't want to get too technical in the games and stuff, but I always end up, my style of game playing is also trying to build as many tanks. Like it's more or less 2 tanks support, and then just try and build physical attacks rather than magic and summons and stuff. And so naturally, Oren is one of my.
He's one of the good ones for attack. Like just straight up like physical sword attack.
yeah, because it's usually, because I think my usual kind of go-to 3 is usually Orange, Tidus and Riku as that, but yeah, Orange usually my major offensive.
That's so funny, but go ahead.
And again, it's like, it's the same with other games as well. It's other games as well. I think Steiner's usually one of my key players if I'm playing for Fantasy 9 and that kind of stuff. So but in terms of the theme itself, the theme is it starts again somber and stuff, but then then starts to almost feel like it's going to start throwing distorted guitars in. So it's like a rock song without overblown distortion in it, and but again there's that kind of almost badassery in it.
Yeah,
but it doesn't overload it because there are revelations about Oren that come to light, which reveal kind of like a key thing about his character,
right?
And which basically means that he's already dead, and he's already dead in a sense. And
that reminds me of that meme: "You're already dead," or "You omae wa mou shinderu."
Yeah. Yeah, but and that kind of melancholy. But he seems to be at peace with it already, because strangely enough, out of all the characters, he's the one he seems to be almost the most collected.
Because he knows what's happening.
Yeah. So because Oren is a character who went on a pilgrimage 10 years before with Yuna's dad, so he knows what to expect. He knows the revelations that are coming.
And with Tidus' dad too. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But I do want to say real fast that with Oren's theme, from a sort of Japanese perspective, he has sort of what you would consider in America as like almost like an Old West vibe. It's not, 1-to-1 because Old West is kind of hokey, but it's all of these musical styles like enka and like piano jazz, like piano bar, piano lounge jazz, that are sort of reminiscent of like gangsters or like old-timey Yakuza or old politician types. And so it kind of like evokes that vibe. And if you watch any amount of Japanese film that wants to be overt about, its characters, you'll kind of see those themes like reappearing, musically at least.
Oh, okay. So in terms of like the Yakuza stuff, so is that like... So in terms of like music, so like how, okay, to use the Western thing, so there's like a certain style of sound you associate with the Wild West movies, like this, like the Sergio Leone kind of. Wow, wow, wow. So is there a kind of musical identity associated with kind of Japanese gangster?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So that's what Orange themes kind of.
Yeah, it kind of reminiscing of it. I mean, it takes like a game version and it adds like those mystical components. It's definitely got a presence of a "this man is already dead" kind of thing flowing through it. But the sort of like very basic melody and the piano arrangement, as well as like the way that they executed with the rhythm and like the sort of tempo, those are associated with like, because in Japan, as you may or may not know, there's a large karaoke culture, and that kind of comes from before, where people would sing enka and different kinds of music. And so coming basically out of post-war and into the modern period, there's like certain types of music that are heavily associated with like basically red light districts, almost like clubs and host clubs and like, as I said, piano lounges. And so I think they like pulled on all of those kinds of like almost like sort of associated with like slightly seedy things, or like authoritative but also dark kind of things. And it's almost like a fantasy, right? It is a fantasy of it, but they drew on that fantasy for his theme.
Oh, okay. Right. Oh, Oh, that's interesting. I'm completely unaware of that. That's quite interesting. Makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I'll send you some more stuff so that you can see what I'm talking about. But I think it's definitely there.
No, that's interesting. So now there's a lot of, because particularly with the development of the character of Oren as well, was that it's like a modern day Ronin. Yeah, like a modern day Ronin.
Like a masterless samurai, he's lost his arm, so like, you know, he's got like, you know, just one sleeve waving in the wind. There's that's Orin, right? Am I confused? But I'm pretty sure that's him. Yeah, so
yeah, he's got one arm. He kind of rests one arm like it's on a sling, which I've never fully understood that, but it just looks so cool.
Well, so the sling thing is actually another visual reference to sort of Japanese. I wouldn't say this is Yakuza exactly, but when they wear I think it's called the haori, and it's like cold or like whatever. Sometimes like you'll see specific, and you'll see this with kitsune as well, which are those fox demons. Instead of wearing the sleeve, they'll just wear their arm as like a sling with the band. It's a cultural indication.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
it
kind of like cool guy.
yeah. I mean,
boss.
I'm learning loads. Yeah, I'm learning loads. This is great stuff. Yeah. Wow, I didn't know that. Particularly a lot of with the music influences and stuff. But so which any other piece of music that you wanted to talk about on this as well, or
like other pieces of music now moving forward? So definitely wanted to talk about all of the themes, and not specifically Jet's theme, right, but like the ones that are around Sin, like the battle music where you've got like, you know, kind of like heavy guitar, as well as like the final boss music when we're fighting off the Jet, even though we find out later that Jet is not the final boss. But those songs, I feel like as when I was playing this, I hadn't really gotten into metal super myself yet. That came a little bit later. So to me, this was like heavy and like, you know, made like a real big impact. And I kind of like felt like you could almost mosh to it as you're playing the game. And so I really liked, I think, what they did with that. Did you have any like feelings about that?
Yeah, because I think particularly with the final battles and the boss musics and the kind of like basically the nature of Sin itself. I think particularly with the melancholic nature of the majority of the sounds, I think you kind of have to emphasize the kind of quick destruction that Sin as this entity causes,
the obliteration.
So, yeah, in the first few moments of the introduction, we see the destruction of the city of Zanarkand through Tidus's point of view, and he sees this massive kind of what looks like a massive tidal wave, this sentient tidal wave, just start shooting these kind of alien, these creatures out and stuff, and destroying these like massive amounts of cities. And it's done to heavy metal music, and it's a theme that happens throughout, where kind of the crunchier the guitars are.
You can hear the licks in your head as like Sin is like throwing stuff everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And with the battle theme as well, the battle theme is a lot more. It has a lot more of a crunch and kick to it. Because it reminds me a lot of "Don't Be Afraid" by in Final Fantasy VIII as well. And particularly with the main battle theme, it's probably the piece of music you're going to be listening to the most in any Final Fantasy game. So you have to get that one right, and you have to make it not boring. And there's like crashing cymbals every like 10 seconds,
and they do enough to make it so it's not disorienting, because there are like some video game soundtracks, like I think it's like Violet City or something like that in Pokemon, or Lavender Town, I don't know, where like you can't play for too long because you start to get like a little bit like headachy, you know. But they do a good job of balancing it, because if you're going to be listening to it just on repeat, it's got to keep you in the mood, you know.
And particularly with the music that surrounds Sin as well, one of the ones I want to talk about, and I think this might be my favourite this is my favourite, I think, from on the whole soundtrack, is very, very early on, is Otherworld, which for years, and I mean for years, and I think the internet kind of convinced me this was true, I thought it was actually Rammstein. And there's a whole thing where people thought it was actually Rammstein, but it's not. So, and it's one of the very few songs in the whole of the Final Fantasy with lyrics. Yeah, and it's...
You gotta name it. Which one is it?
Otherworld.
Oh, Otherworld. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I got it. Oh, yeah. I think this was one of the ones that I was referencing when I said you can hear the licks in your head. It's the...
Yeah.
Yeah.
As soon, you just see this wave of energy destroy a whole building with that, and then there's like kind of death metal vocals, and and for years he's like, "Go now if you want it," and it's like, and I'm not a death metal fan. I'm really not much of a death metal fan, but when you put it to the visuals that you're seeing and the destruction and the kinetic kind of agency that happens with the game, and it's also in terms of kind of game design as well. There's a bit where the music's playing in the battle theme, and the first time you actually go into an actual fight, you go into a normal Final Fantasy fight, you beat a couple of monsters, but then the characters run to into the next fight, and you don't go back to the world map, and it's in like, as a player, if you've played the early games, you're like, wait, what?
That sense of doom is so like prevalent through it, but there's that frenetic energy, like it just brings you into the, like this attack basically, where like Sin has just like popped up, and these people don't even know who Sin is, right? Like they don't know what they're expecting, and so it's just chaos, and that music is just taking you through it. So even if you don't play the game, but you're listening to this podcast and you've gotten to this point, I highly recommend going on YouTube and just watching Destruction of Xanarkand, because you'll see this, and it's just such an experience. Yeah,
I mean, and I mean, literally, like just before we started recording, I had a quick look at the lyrics, because I never really fully listened to the lyrics, or
you're just like
them and stuff.
Like that's it, because it just just does that.
Yeah, and basically, the lyrics are a spoiler for the plot.
Oh no, what are the lyrics? You gotta say the lyrics now.
Yeah. So basically, so it goes, go now, if you want it, another world awaits you. Don't you give up on it, you bite the hand that feeds you. All alone, cold fills you wonder, memories of it cloud your sight. Fills your dreams, disturbs your slumber, lost your way of fallen night. Hold now, aim is steady, another world awaits you. 1,000 years, you ready, the other world it takes you. And that's the first bit. And I'm like going like, he's just basically spoiling the plot for the next 2 hours.
That's so funny. Have you ever watched those videos where YouTubers will go like, oh, it's all in an anime opening, and then when they go over the anime opening, you realize the anime opening tells you every single thing that's going to happen in the next 13 episodes. That's like a very old version of that.
No, I don't watch that much anime, but admittedly, but I think I know what kind of stuff where they're kind of like, oh yeah, this thing just spoils everything for the...
Right, but you don't know, because in the opening it just seems so innocent. You're like, oh, it's just a random character doing a random thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so there's a bit as well. So the bit where there's a bit just after that where there's this like guy going, go into the sand and the dust in the sky. Go now, no better plan than to do or die. Feed me, pray to the faith in the face of the light. Feed me, fill me with sin. Now get ready to fight. Now, anyone who's not played the game is not going to understand what the hell I've just said, but pretty much that spoils about a big key revelation in the actual game as well.
Right. Yeah. Like, it's one of those things where, like, if you happen to remember it, then you'll figure out what's going on probably 2 hours before the big reveal. Like 2 game hours. Yeah. Not too far, but a little bit.
Yeah. I'm not going to say what... there's a reveal about one of the main characters. I'm not going to go too much into it because it will take time to explain, but there's a key kind of... anyone who's played Final Fantasy VII, there's a Cloud Soldier revelation type thing about one of the main characters, which changes how you see them. But and again, I apologise if you have no idea what I'm talking about, but yeah, that pretty much references that. But that, I mean, that song, I mean, I'm not a death metal fan, but it's a key thing of being able to match the energy of what they need to do in the game, mixed with the music and stuff, and it just works really well. And I think as well, it's a part of me thinks it's also a key thing, saying that, okay, we're on the next gen console, let's throw an actual death metal song with lyrics in it. We couldn't really do as much as that as we perhaps wanted to in previous games, but let's do it now.
Yeah, and they took it just as far as it needed to go. It wasn't like too hardcore, but it was like really good, and like sort of like listeners who haven't been exposed to music that heavy yet can handle it, as well as like people who like do like heavy music can still enjoy it. So they did such a good job with that.
Yeah. And before we move on, there's a nice little thing that I found about this song where the lyrics were written by Alexander O. Smith, and it was sung by Bill Moore, who was a frontman of a death metal band that was active in Tokyo at the time called
That's
Till
amazing.
I Die. The song was already fully formed when Smith was tasked to writing lyrics for it based on a Guy track. Smith's lyrics were loosely based on the Song of Wandering Angels, a poem by W.B. Yeats. Now, Smith mistook a guitar solo section of the song for another part they had to fill with lyrics, so he wrote in that spoken word part in, and I put into quotes, one of those Limp Bizkit style breakdowns, but Uematsu liked the results and kept it in, and that's the bit where it's like, it's not the death metal lyrics, it's the hi, it's the blah 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 to the sky. Yeah, he put that in not realising it was a guitar solo.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so but then Uematsu loved it so much he kept it in.
Yeah, I mean, Uematsu seems like he's got some chaotic neutral energy. He's like, yes, let's go.
Yeah, or a sense of humour of things as well.
Sense of humour for sure.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of the time. Okay, I know I've got one song that I want to briefly mention as well. But is there a song that you want to?
No, I mean, I think we touched briefly on the song, the Hymn of the Faith, and I think like the Veil 4, for instance, like, which is, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but like the Aeon music. But I think those are all like fun things that people should play the game to hear more about. We talked about them, so go on with the song that you are interested in.
Yeah, So the reason I want to briefly talk about this game, because I think it's one of the pieces of music that I remember being affected by as I was playing it, and the way it's used and how it's implemented in the game works really well, and it still haunts me to this day. It's a music called Servants of the Mountain.
Okay, the Ronso.
Yeah, So the Ronso are a kind of, think multicolored Chewbacca.
Yes.
With unicorn horns. One of the player characters is a character called Kumari, who's kind of mocked for being like, he's about 7 foot, but he's also one of the shortest Ronso, and he's kind of ostracised because I think he lost a fight and his horns broke, and that's kind of like a taboo in Ronso culture and stuff. And there's a part, and to get to Zanarkand, you have to go through what's called Mount Gagazet, and it's where the Ronso homeland. So, but then very early on, there's a whole thing where you see one of the villains who we've not brought up. Is a character
we
called
don't
Seymour,
talk about him. He's not interesting.
Yeah. He reveals that he's just ended up almost committing genocide. For pretty much any Ronso that was on the mountain, he just killed, and then this song plays through, and it's very somber, it's very kind of affecting, and basically you're then wandering through the mountains for a good hour because the map's massive, and this music is playing through, but the ingenious twist is that when you go into the battle sequence, any other part of the game, the music changes to the kind of hyperactive battle theme that I was talking about earlier. But the music continues with this Song of the Faith throughout all the battles, so it's forcing you to reflect on kind of like the
Servants of the Mountains. You mean not the Song of the Faith?
Yeah, sorry, Servants of the Mountain, sorry. Yeah, so the Servants of this Mountain song, so you're basically, this music is playing through all the battles, and it's uninterruptedly on a loop. So you're listening to like the 5-minute song for about an hour, but because of what's happened in the plot and the story, that it's just so affecting that you're going through this thing.
I mean, that one is like the big reveal of like real, like, you know, substantial evil, I think, in Final Fantasy X, because, you know, it's all good to have like a monster that just appears and sort of like unilaterally and like sort of like it doesn't have like like it doesn't make a decision about who it's going to kill. It kills everything. But now you have sort of like within the world itself, like a character that was, you know, he was sus when he was introduced, but like now you're starting to see like what in the name of religion like this man is willing to do. And Kimari has been sort of a protective figure on the team, and you don't know too much about him, and then you find out like, you know, there's so much not like there's so much anger there with his tribe, where like, you know, like, get off our mountain, like, what are you guys doing here, you're not welcome, and now you have to just like run around and like feel this thing.
Yeah, and I think as well the character of Kumari just before that moment kind of has his kind of redemption, well, not redemption, kind of finally gets some level of respect from some of his peers just before they're all suddenly killed, which kind of adds that layer of tragedy to it. But yeah, I remember playing that for the first time, and you're wandering around this kind of this wintry, kind of cold, depressing,
right,
snow with this kind of really kind of.
The good thing about this scene for me that I remember very well was at this point I had done so much grinding and training on the sphere grid, which is a completely different concept, but we'll talk about not on this podcast.
Yeah.
That's for a game podcast.
Yeah.
But that by the time I actually ran into Seymour, like it did not, I think I blinked and it was over. Like I just like overpowered him.
Yeah.
Like he was so irrelevant in that fight on Mount Gagazet.
Yeah, I think it was quite easy for me as well, which kind of undercut the kind of struggle to beat. I think you're supposed to find it a tough battle, I think, at the time.
Well,
but
I don't know if you are. Maybe they were just like, you know what? Yeah, he's done too much.
Yeah, but then again, though, again, we're not going to have a chance to get through because it's a video game podcast. I do. One negative I will give to Final Fantasy X, I think it's got the weakest final bosses.
Oh, I was gonna mention that. So I don't know how you beat it, but I'm pretty sure I beat it by casting full life, which really pissed me off because for like about 3 or 4 hours I had been trying to beat it in a fair way when I realized that it had a zombie stat on.
Oh, I just casting Reflect on him.
You were casting Reflect. No, I cast full life. So yeah.
Yeah, I think if you cast Reflect on him, none of the healing works.
Great.
Yeah. So with Servants of the Mountain, that's one piece of music I remember massively affecting me.
Yes.
It's up there with some of my favourite Final Fantasy songs of all time. Coincidentally, before we move on to the next one, so in terms of all Final Fantasy, what's your favourite piece of Final Fantasy music? My
favourite piece of Final Fantasy music across the board.
Yeah.
Hang on one second. I have to think. We can get my thinking to be less long through editing.
Oh yeah, I'll understand. Yeah.
Okay, so immediately what jumps out and like I am having a hard time moving away from it is actually Kingdom Hearts. And that is gonna probably be Dearly Beloved. I don't know. I think that one just like impacted me strongly. But if we're gonna stick to just Final Fantasy, and I feel that we should do that, I would have to say Titus's theme or Titus's theme. Sorry, I tried. But that's the one for me. I like Yuna's theme as well. I like Via Purifico. I like, Besaid Island. But for me, like the one that like always just like I go back to listen to is Titus's theme.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
What about you?
That's interesting. I'm gonna have to dip to Final Fantasy VIII for this one.
Okay.
My favourite is what is called, I think, Ride On, which is the Ragnarok theme. So yeah, basically in any kind of Final Fantasy game, there's a point where you get the airship near the end of the game, and it allows you to explore everywhere. In Final Fantasy VIII, you have this kind of abandoned, kind of dragon-like space vessel that you get, and the music is amazing. I remember just driving around, just flying around, just listening to the music. The music's only about a minute and 30 seconds long, so it doesn't. Yeah, so it's really short.
And
piece
also,
of music.
I don't know if they did this in every Final Fantasy, but you brought up the airship, so I want to say that in Final Fantasy X, there is like a stop where you can just go and listen to the soundtrack. Like, did you find it?
No.
Yeah, there's an airship stop that you can go to and just listen to the soundtrack. That's all you do there. It has like a billboard, and you can like, select a song and just like listen to it.
Wow, okay, I did not know that.
Yeah, strange. Yeah, I spend my time doing a lot of weird quests in games that people don't really like. I don't know. I don't even know how I found it. But yeah, so yours is Final Fantasy VIII. I wonder if all Final Fantasies have that sort of like pit stop where you can listen to music.
I know in Final Fantasy 15, you can download packs for the radio.
Right.
For the car radio. So, because I know Ride On by Final Fantasy VIII was actually on the car radio.
That's hilarious.
So I was so because it takes you a while to actually get the experience points to be able to free drive around Final Fantasy 15, and like you can, and the radio allows you to kind of play like a music library of old song music from previous games. And I found a Final Fantasy VIII one, and I was just playing it, and I was just listening to Ride On.
That's hilarious.
And that was great. It's like, this is like Final Fantasy VIII, except I'm on the road instead of flying.
Right, like, you take like some of the nostalgia bits from the other Final Fantasies and just like play it on the radio and get that feeling because the game is empty.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's fine, but before we start moaning about some of Final Fantasy 15. So the reception, the Final Fantasy X soundtrack reached number 4 on the Oricon charts and sold 140,000 copies as of January 2010. I couldn't find a value for now, but the album was moderately well received. While some reviewers felt it to be an absolutely amazing soundtrack, others only found it to be satisfying work that was not all I was hoping for, in quotation marks. Some reviewers felt that of the 3 composers, Uematsu's pieces were the weakest, citing them as having a tendency to be buried under the compositions of the others, which I don't believe in. The same reviewers, however, noted that some of the best pieces on the soundtrack, such as Tuzanakund, were the work of Uematsu. Hamauzu's contributions were seen as some of his best work, and reviewers felt that both he and Nakano brought a myriad of new flavours to the soundtrack and were very well received. Final Fantasy X soundtrack, though not re-released after the original soundtrack was brought to North America, was seen as a good sampler of the music from the full soundtrack. So yeah, because it was released, I think a cut down version was released, so you didn't have the full 4-disc 4-hour version. There was like an hour cut down version, but I'm not 100% sure what was on that.
Yeah, me neither, because I stole music. No, I didn't. I listened to it in game. That's what I did. So did I. Right.
So have you ever seen any of it perform live?
No, and that is on my bucket list as a major thing that I must do once in this life. Like, I have to go to a Final Fantasy X specifically orchestra concert. Like, I have to.
I know there's Distant Worlds that did a global tour.
I know, and I think there was another one coming around because it happens fairly frequently now. It's not like the main cast or something like that. It'll be different orchestras performing it. But then the great pandemic hit, so that is postponed until post Great Pandemic. But it is definitely something that I will be doing.
Yeah, cause I know I watched on YouTube earlier today. Actually, there's about an hour's orchestra performance of Final Fantasy X. So like, it's because it starts. I don't think it's official. I'm not sure. I don't think it was official. I'm not sure. But there was like a full orchestra playing a few tracks from it, and like say, it opens up with this guy on a grand piano doing two Zanarkand, and unfortunately there was no Other World, which is
that's the bummer.
Yeah, they never played actually. And one thing they didn't play was they did, but they didn't do a vocal version. They did a instrumental version, Suteki Deni, which is the other kind of song with vocals,
right?
Which so that was on there as well. And there's quite a couple of instances where they kind of mixed in, brought back to Zanarkand with some of the Hymn of the Fates and stuff, and it was really nice actually. I mean, I'm not someone who would see myself going to watch an orchestra play score music. The Final Fantasy series, I probably would make an exception for. The only thing I've always been a bit iffy on is that I know I'll get there and there'll be a whole section where it's they're playing music from some of the games I don't play.
Right.
Or I'm not familiar with. Like, okay, we're going to have 20 minutes of Final Fantasy 3. Oh, God.
I mean, that's your bathroom break. That's your chance to go to the bathroom.
Yes, yeah.
I do like orchestra music. I like live music. If there is ever live music easily accessible to me anywhere, I will tend to go just because it is live. Not considering genre or how much I like it. So this is like an easy sell for me. Like, it's live, but then there's also an orchestra. They're very skilled musicians, and on top of that, they're playing Final Fantasy music. Like, I'm there.
Yeah, because I think as well. I think Riki, who sang Suketi Deni,
Suteki Dane. Yeah.
Suteki Deni. Right, I think she actually appeared. I think she cameos on a couple of the orchestral moments of that. So she sang it with an orchestra.
Oh, that's cool.
Well.
That is very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would have been really nice to have seen. But yeah. So this is the bit where I say about other albums in the subject's discography. So Nobuya Uematsu's other work. We've briefly touched upon it, and I think we'll probably go for hours talking about some of his other stuff. But if people have listened to this and perhaps want to dip into any of his other work, where would you suggest they go after Final Fantasy X?
Hold on, give me. It's because he has so much work. So I think obviously Final Fantasy X, because we're talking about it. And then the other Final Fantasies, because he is literally on all of them. And then give me 1 second. He's got so much music I can't decide. This is like one of those questions where it's like, oh, you read books? Which is your favorite book? Jesus Christ, like what do you mean? Okay, so I will recommend go Final Fantasy X first, because he really outdoes himself. Then I think I really like listening to, whenever I do like sort of compilations or like playlists, I end up listening to his other Final Fantasy music. So definitely that. And then I would say check out some of his anime music. So he's done a few animes. One is Oh My Goddess the movie, which everyone should watch. And then the other one is Fairy Tail the movie, The Phoenix Priestess. He does the ending theme, so go for that one as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll check them. I'll listen to some of them. So and I think we've now reached the end of our conversation, Pragya.
Yes.
So it's been great to chat to you about Final Fantasy X, but there's a couple of kind of like very important questions to ask. Well, the important question.
Right.
So the song for the Spotify Hall of Fame playlist.
Okay.
So for those who've not listened before, what this is, I'm going to ask Pragya to choose one song from the Final Fantasy X soundtrack to be immortalised forever on the Spotify Hall of Fame playlist. I can't veto it, so whatever she says goes. So, which song are you going to pick?
I'll be kind to you. It'll be Otherworld.
Oh, nice.
Yes. I mean, I hope Spotify has it, but I mean,
it does.
Okay.
It does.
You're like, I know.
Yeah, so
I know.
Yeah, I've been listening to it. The last couple of days. So, yes, come on,
yes,
Otherworld.
yes,
yes.
I think that one's such a good one for this. Like, could have been too Xanarkand. I could have been a little bit selfish and put Titus's theme on there and been like, Pragya was here. But I think Otherworlds is just such a great song, and we both agreed on its like sort of, I guess like iconicness and like just like importance.
No, yeah. So that's interesting as well, because I was quite interested to see what was going to follow the previous ones, because I had. Yeah, because I was saying a bit earlier on that because this is going to be following Scatman John, and in the previous episode on there, and before then was Jesus of Suburbia by Green Day. So
it's good. We're keeping the theme sort of.
Yeah, yeah. So we're going from Jesus of Suburbia, Scatman's Eurodance, jazz pop type thing, death metal,
right.
Death metal stuff, but no, yeah, I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that. No complaints. So I'm not going to say I can't veto it, but there's no resistance from me for that. But so Otherworld joins the ever-growing. It's the 81st track to go onto that playlist.
Nice.
So, and that's so we definitely finished. Gone to our end of our chat, and it's been great to speak to you on that. But if people want to find you and the podcast that you are on, where can they find you?
Right, so you can find us. We are the Real Asian Podcast. We do basically, casual conversations, kind of like this one, about Asian films. We include Asian American within our sort of scope, and it's really a fun podcast where if you like that conversation I was having about Oren and the weird musical references within his theme, you can find us, and I think you'll find lots of really interesting conversations. So you guys can find us on Instagram at Real Asian Podcast. That is REEL Asian Podcast, right? So Real Asian Podcast. So come follow us, come listen to a little bit of what we do, and if you like it, follow and subscribe and comment and all that.
And with that, and that's unfortunately we're at an end now. And again, thank you ever so much for popping on.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun talking about it. So Final Fantasy X soundtrack. Really glad I was able to pick something that you enjoyed. So I had a lot of fun and I'm looking forward to, hearing this, and very excited. Thank you.
You've been listening to Pick a Disc, and I've been your host, Matthew Latham. Our theme music is Pump by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Pick a Disc is hosted by the We Made This podcast network, and you can find them on www.spreaker.com/user/WeMadeThis. You can find the Pick a Disc show site on www.spreaker.com/show/pickadisc. You can find us on all the usual social media type places like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter under Pick a Disc. You can also email us on pickadisc@gmail.com. Until next time, happy listening to all those discs that you are picking. Goodbye.
Hello everyone, this is Tony, Network Chief of We Made This. As you know, our podcast network brings together a brilliant assortment of talent who talk about all kinds of pop culture content, such as the episode you just listened to, or maybe you're just about to listen to. We're not going anywhere, but we'd love to keep the lights on for even longer if you're able to support our network on Patreon. For just £2 a month, you get your name in lights and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping us produce more great audio. And for £3 a month, you'll get your name in lights, but you'll also get access to an exclusive bi-monthly podcast from the We Made This talent pool on podcasting, pop culture, and, well, you tell us. We'll take your suggestions. For less than the price of a coffee per month, you can help keep We Made This going. Just head to patreon.com/We Made This. That's patreon.com/We Made This. And get the ball rolling. Now, back to your scheduled programming. Elsewhere on We Made This. We are Starfleet, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
His ship, he's like, let me go out there, let me help, I want to head out, scout things out. And he gets overruled, which I think rightly so. I think that, and you tell me what you think here, Craig. In my opinion, I think Booker is trying to do maybe a little bit too much.
He just wants to be useful, he wants to keep busy, he's struggling to process everything, so he just doesn't want to be idle for any length of time, which you can completely understand. It's just, as soon as there's something to do, he's like, let me do it.
Academy Watch.
I call it the Swing and a Miss Award for Mark Rylance's performance. Mark Rylance in this film is playing a tech entrepreneur, and I can see exactly the conception for this particular performance. There is when we look at our tech entrepreneurs, there is kind of the cult side to them, the cult of Elon Musk, kind of the cult of Peter Thiel and Bezos and Zuckerberg, etc. But they all do have this kind of ethereal nature to them as well. When you see them on TV, they're not quite. There's something quite detached about some of these guys.
Free with this month's issue.
AJ Popoff. That's him. Not A and then the letter J. A.Jay Popoff. And Jeremy Popoff.
Do you think he's a bird disguised as a human? And that's
a J.
He's a J.
Yeah.
And that is his subtle clue to the world that he is actually a bird, not actually a human.
They're fulfilling one of my theories, which is at least one of the band is a massive douchebag because they have got over 10 ex-members.
Oh.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.